Hi folks, so today we're going to talk about the brakes, an area where BMW have got a bit of previous with making brakes that aren't quite up to the car, and the M135i and M140i are no different on that front. The brakes are standard. On a brand new car they feel alright, they're not scary. There never feels like there's much power in the brakes, but they do stop you if they need them to. Once they're a little bit older, they just feel rubbish. They really do. This car, when I bought it, it had the JB4 fitted, but was on standard brakes, which were, the car was, I think, just under 17,000 miles old. The brakes were past it at that point already. And they just felt rubbish. There was no power in the pedal. There was no confidence in the top of the pedal. And when you pushed on, you really had to sort of not stand on the brakes, but you had to give good pressure to the pedal to get it to pull you up. Which is not what you want from a car that's got 450 brake horsepower. So I've tried an awful lot of different things on this car. I've used lots of different brakes on various other cars at the track, on the road as well, but I'll try and speak mainly about what I've used on this car, and in particular the solution that I've come to in the end. So the pads that I have tried on this car are the OEM BMW pads. I've tried the non-sport M4 pads, or the non-M Performance M4 pads. I've tried Stoptech Sports, which I've used on other cars to great effect, EBC yellow stuff, DS2500s, and finally I think DS Unos. Now, of all of those pads, I think it's fair to say two have impressed, those being actually both of the Ferodos. I don't historically really like Ferodo pads, because they have a bit of a habit of leaving deposits on the discs and causing that horrible juddering sensation that lots of people mistake in a lot of cases for warping of the discs, and it's a horrible sensation, and in the past I've just not really liked them as pads. In the case of this car though, it's really demanding on pads and on brakes, and both of those pads that I've mentioned from Ferodo, the 2500 and the DS Uno, do a really good job. So the 2500 I use as a road pad. I wouldn't use it on track. I don't think it's up to the job. I know some people do use it on track. Effectively, we all drive differently. Some people are better brakers than others, so that might explain why other people are able to use them and I'm not. Perhaps I'm a little bit too conservative with my braking in this car, because I don't want to mistreat, I don't have masses of confidence in the brakes sometimes. Perhaps it's to do with the tracks as well that we visit. I mean, I test this car at Blyton Park, which is, if not the most, it's got to be one of the most demanding tracks in the UK on pads, just because there's quite a few big stops, and there aren't really any fast flowing parts of the circuit that sort of leave you off the brakes for any period of time so that it gets to cool down. So it does tear through brakes, and it really does test them. So where I say the 2500s aren't up to the task, in my case at Blyton Park, my driving style, with the slightly wider rubber and more power, they're not. You might find otherwise a big fast open flowing track in a standard powered car or whatever which you drive. Try for yourself, but the recommendations that I make will be based on what I've found to work and not work for me. So yeah, like I said, I use them as a road pad. I like to have a bit more power in the brake pedal than you get as standard. I quite like the Stoptech Sports in that regard. they would make a pretty good road pad as well. However, they've gone up in price. They were about £110 for the front pads, I think as little as 60 for the rears, so they were a real bargain. And with that in mind, they sort of work well as a road pad, but they've gone up now, and they're not really good enough for the hike in price, so I'd struggle to recommend them. The yellow stuffs, just don't like them, to be honest. I gave them another chance. I've used yellow stuffs on other cars in the past, probably a few years ago, and I didn't really like them. I noticed other people speaking more highly again about them recently, and thought, you know what, things change, compounds evolve, technologies move on. I'll try them again, but to me they still feel wooden. There's so little feel through the pedal, and ultimately the stopping power wasn't there either. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend them either, to be honest. The M4 pad, that's a nice pad. Quite like the M4 pad. As a road pad, that's a good option. I just feel like the 2500s have just got a bit more in the bank. If you're leaning on them heavily, if you're doing a weekend away driving or something, and you might be doing some sort of more prolonged spirited drives, I feel like the 2500s just give you a little bit more confidence that they're there with you on a longer drive. Now on the track, I've tried a number of these pads that I've mentioned on the track, the Stoptech Sports, the M4 pads, the yellow stuffs, and none of those could really hang with the car. They all gave up. The DS Unos didn't, however. They're a really good value pad. They are quite an extreme pad, I would say. I have used them on the road, but when you stop using them hard, the pad transfer on the disc wears away, and then they start squealing really, really loud. So I've moved away from using them on the road, but they can be used on the road if you're the sort of person who hares around all the time, is always stomping on the brakes, and is driving quickly on roads that suit it all the time. You could use the Unos on the road, but not for me. On the track, they make a good pad. They work really well, never gave up, really, really strong braking. The one problem for me was I got halfway through the pad life and the pads cracked. So I struggled. It might be a one-off thing. It might be something that someone else would look at and keep using them, but not for me. So I struggle to recommend them as well. I do think they're a good pad. Perhaps things just got a bit too hot. Maybe I was just unlucky, but they have cracked a bit, and so I'd struggle to recommend them too. So in terms of recommendations pad-wise, I would recommend the 2500 without hesitation as a purely road pad for someone who wants some more performance from the brakes. For the track, we're going to have to go to something like an RS29 from Padgett. There are a great many M140 and full M car owners that use their cars at the track regularly with the Padgetts, and they're very expensive, but they work. So if you want a hassle-free, guaranteed solution, the RS29s are the ones to go for track. Alternatively, from personal experience, albeit not on this car, Stoptech will make a fabulous pad. They'll also be on the expensive side, but something like an XP10 or an XP12 on the front with an XP10 or an XP8 on the rear will be all the pad you need on these cars, without a doubt. So yeah, if you're looking to track the car, I would say the Stoptechs or the Padgetts would be the ones that I'll go for next on this car. So beyond the pads, disc-wise, I'm a big fan of just normal plain discs. To be honest, I always use a good quality disc. On this, I've used the genuine BMW discs. I know some people have had some problems with them, but I struggle to think that BMW can't make or at least source a really good quality disc. So I went genuine. Other brands that I would use without hesitation would be Brembo and Padgett. I'd steer away from grooved and drilled. I know that the full M cars have these sorts of discs, and more cars have them nowadays. But my own experience on track, I've used plain discs, nothing more, from good quality brands, and really given them terrible abuse time and time again on track. And I have only ever had one disc failure. That was when I chose to use an M-Tech disc, and in my opinion, I paid the price for using a budget product to do something that I've used premium products in the past. So I know some people are using M-Tech discs now on these cars, but for me, I'd steer clear and stick with something like a Brembo or a Padgett. Fluid. To be honest, I think in most cases, the standard or a standard equivalent fluid changed, in my opinion, if you use your car hard, maybe changed it annually, will be up to the job. If you track your car, you need quite a heavy duty fluid. I've tried ATE Type 200, I think it's called now, or Type 2000. I've used that on the MX-5s and stuff lots when it was ATE Blue, and that was always very good there. But I found across various cars that once you get up to maybe 1200 kilos, the ATE isn't quite up to the job. Again, we're putting them through the mill by driving at Blyton, so others might have different experiences. But for something like this, I probably recommend a Motul RBF 660, or the Gulf one is the one that I use, and that is called I think it's called the RB or the RF 1000. And both the Motul and the Gulf are very good fluids I've used personally, and they're reasonably priced as well. If you're looking for something that's probably got a longer life, so you don't have to change as frequently, the Castrol SRF fluid is very good. It's got a higher wet boiling point, and so you don't need to change that as regularly, but that is a bit pricier. In terms of lines, I don't know the full details, but I understand that the standard lines are Kevlar reinforced, and basically they shouldn't be a weak point. I've put the Goodrich braided hoses on this car purely because I've had quite a lot of track cars, spent a lot of time on track, and always used braided lines, never with issue. So to me it seemed like it's always been part of my track car preparation, and I didn't really see any reason for the sake of 70-80 pounds of not doing that this time for the sake of that money. So you probably don't need them, but belt and braces approached, I chose to put the Goodrich lines on. Okay, so if you've made it this far into the video, you've got to a bit of a secret. It's not really a secret at all, but there's just not many people that are aware of it, or that do it to their cars. Lots of people fit uprated discs actually, and pads as well, but not that many people do the brake coding. And if you're anything like me and you're more mechanically minded than electronically minded, this seems ridiculous, but you can actually code the braking on these cars. You can't do it through BIMA code and stuff like that through your phone. You need to take it to someone who's got some posher software and a cable. It's probably not that difficult, but that's what I did. And the coding, I honestly don't know what it changes. It must be something to do with the servo assistance, the power of the servo assistance, the point at which it, the way it relates to the pedal. I honestly don't know how it works. What I do know is the feel of the pedal is much improved, where you sort of feel like it's really quite spongy and you just don't feel like it's with you. The coding improves that. I wouldn't say it's the cure-all. You don't just do the coding on an otherwise standard system and your brakes are brilliant. It just improves the feel of them. And if you're you know, if you're going to town with your car and you want it to perform as well as you possibly can, I paid £30 for the coating. It was worth probably closer to £100 in terms of the improvement, in my opinion. So for me, that's a no-brainer, and something that's really very easy to do. So yeah, I would say my first port of call for anybody that's upgrading their car and wants more from the brakes, for me, a standard car deserves better brakes on these. So my recommendations would be, look, make sure your discs are in good order. You know, if you understand how brakes work and the piston is fundamentally pushing the pad onto the disc, you know, if your disc's worn and it's thinner, everything's got to move further. So if your discs are well worn, even if they're not quite at the limit, maybe change them when you do your pads. So then your pads have got the best possible chance of putting a really good coating of the transfer onto the discs. Everything's new, everything meshes perfectly, and then you get that nice full disc thickness, so your brakes are as responsive as possible. They're expensive, but you're going to have to do it sooner or later anyway, so I chose to do the discs and pads at the same time. So yeah, if your discs are anywhere near worn, I'd say do them as well. But my solution to upgrade the brakes for someone on the road would be some Ferodo DS2500 pads. I would just refresh the fluid, not necessarily an uprated fluid, and I'd do the brake coating as well. For those going to the track, I would say absolutely you need a performance fluid. I mentioned the Motul and the Gulp fluids there, and then the Padgid RS29s or the Carbotech XP10s or 12s for the track. For the track as well, I'd probably say pop some cooling in particular to the front calipers and discs. You might not want to hack around too much with arch liners and stuff, but there's probably a way of getting some fresh air in there, and that would probably help no end. So please excuse the state of me. I've been into the gym because the battery died, so I'm a bit of a sweaty mess. So in addition to the actual braking upgrades, I've upsized the tyres on my car. So on the road I'm using a 235 40/18 on the front, up from 225, and on the rear I'm using a 255 35/18 up from a 245. So the extra rubber just gives you a bigger footprint, and essentially it just improves the grip and therefore the amount of stopping power. You can only stop as quick as your tyres can grip, so yeah, the one surefire way to improve your braking at the limit or at the threshold is to improve the grip of the tyres. No matter what you do to the actual brakes, it's not going to do much unless your tyres can actually stop you. Of note as well, of course, is the actual tyre itself. So I'll do another video on my personal tyre choices, but suffice to say, if you've got ling-longs on, you're not going to stop very quickly regardless of what brakes you've got on there. So I've talked through what I've actually done to the car, but how does it feel? So to be honest, the brakes still don't feel spectacular. They're not, if you like the feel of a really modern over-servoed car, they don't do that. If you drive it back to back with, say, a new M140i, the brakes won't feel as sharp, but they're strong. There's much more braking at the top of the pedal. The braking power is consistent, so you don't go through any spongy soft patches in the pedal travel, and when you lean on them, they probably feel stronger and stronger rather than feeling weaker like the standard brakes. When you get into the standard brakes, you use them a bit more, you're on a bit of a spirited drive, they seem to just get worse and worse. Whereas these, as you get some heat into them, they seem to come to, you get a bit more transfer onto the discs and they just get stronger and stronger. In terms of are they too sharp? Not at all. They're absolutely fine. The DS Unos are actually fine as well. They're a little bit sharp at the top of the pedal, when you've got good transfer on the discs, but you know, it's not an over servoed new car, so you know, if you've got any sensitivity in your braking foot, you'll be absolutely fine. In terms of living with them, squeaking, so the DS2500 very rarely squeak. In fact, the only time they squeak is when they really haven't been used hard at all. If you drive around for a month without any hard braking, they'll probably start squeaking. It's not that horrible intrusive squeaking you get from serious pads. The Unos were terrible for that. So the squeaking isn't that horrible, super loud, intrusive squeaking that you get from a more serious track bias pad. The DS Unos are like that. They're really not livable once they lose that transfer from the pad on the disc. But the 2500s, they squeal a little bit if they're not used in anger much. If they're used for a sort of nice mix of all sorts of driving, might have been perfectly silent, but for a period of time where sort of over the Christmas break the car really didn't get used hard at all, and then they started squeaking just a little bit when I was going slowly. In terms of costs, I'll try and remember what everything's cost. These are powerful, heavy cars with relatively big brakes, and so they're not cheap. But to be frank, if you've got a 400 horsepower, 1500 kilo car and you're expecting consumables to be cheap, then you're living in cloud cuckoo land. You've got to be prepared to fork out for stuff that stops you. The prices, so the DS2500s, I got mine through eBay. I think it was Demon Tweaks through eBay. I just watched out until eBay had one of their, I think I even got a 20% off day, and they became really cost effective, but they frequently do 10 or 15% days where I'm sure eBay subsidised the reductions of the sellers, and so I think my front pads cost as little as £115. I think typically the 2500s will cost maybe 150, 160, but if you're in no rush, I would aim to get them for sort of 130 or less. The rears, to be honest, they're a very similar price to the fronts for the 2500s, so again, expect to pay about that for them. For something more track focused, so the DS Unos, I think they're about £200 an axle. Again, they were a decent pad, but wouldn't necessarily be my recommendation. Something like a RS29 will be expensive. They're probably going to be £400 or £500 for the set. The Carbotechs, I suspect around the same amount. So these are not a cheap car to track, albeit if you invest in something like the Carbotechs or the RS29s, they'll probably last quite a long time. And so, you know, over the course of say 8 track days, you might go through one set of pads rather than 2 of the sort of cheaper pads. Discs, again, they're quite costly. They're a 2-piece construction from BMW, and of course we sort of want to keep our cars performing as they can, so we veer away from the cheaper 1-piece discs. And I think I got a bit of money off my discs, to be honest, and I think I paid about 360 for the front and rears. Typically, I suspect you'd be paying closer to £400 for them from BMW. Fluid, off the top of my head, I think 500ml of the gulp for the Motul is probably about £17, something like that. So yeah, about 30 quid or so for a litre of the stuff. Lines, I think they're about 75 quid from Goodrich. Again, that's a sort of an optional. I chose to do it just because anything that I track, I'll pop some braided lines on. The coding, I think I got that quite cheap. That was £30, but I'd happily pay more than that if I needed to. In fact, I'll pop the name of the chap that did the coding for me in the description. I can't remember it. He was in Southport near Liverpool, so thank you very much. I'm sorry I forget your name, or at least the company name, so I'll pop that in the description below. So altogether, let's say it's a road car. You've got, say you do quite well, and you've got the pads for 250, the discs say 400, that's 650. Not going to do the lines, £30 for the fluid, that's 680, and some coding, if you pay the same as me, that's 720. So it's not a cheap upgrade, These cars are typically north of £20,000 though. You know, we'll all go out there and we'll spend £350, £400 on tuning. You know, I put a sports cat on my car and they're more than that even. So perhaps for the cost of a sports cat or something, or say tuning and a decat, you're upgrading something that the car leaves the factory wanting. The power's there already, but the stopping power for me is something really important, and I'm afraid it's another must-have, guys. The one redeeming factor is that a lot of these things are consumables anyway, so you've got to spend the money on something, albeit not quite as expensive, but in my opinion, if you've got to replace it, you may as well upgrade it. And so even for sort of £750, it's a very worthwhile way of spending a bit of money on these cars, and they're all the better for it.